In 1987, on an isolated road south of Sedalia, Colorado, investigators placed two ordinary brown paper bags over the hands of a murdered woman. They were not searching the bags for evidence. The bags were the equipment. Their purpose was simply to protect anything the victim might still be holding beneath her fingernails or against her skin. When the investigation ended without an arrest, those bags were sealed away with the rest of the evidence. They remained there for nearly 38 years. Then, in 2025, a forensic scientist examined them again. And investigators discovered that the most important evidence had never been inside the victim's hands. It had been transferred onto the bags themselves. Skin cells belonging to a stranger had survived inside the brown paper for almost 4 decades. When the DNA was entered into a national database, it did not lead detectives to an unknown man living quietly under a different name. It led them to one of Colorado's most dangerous serial killers, a man who had already been convicted of murder before this woman died, a man who had been released from prison less than 2 months before her body was discovered, and a man who had been dead for almost 30 years by the time the evidence finally revealed what he had done. The victim's name was Rhonda Marie Fisher. She was 30 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. On the night of March 31st, 1987, Rhonda was seen walking north along Monaco Parkway toward Leetsdale Drive in Denver. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By the following day, she was approximately 30 miles away. A motorist traveling along South Perry Park Road noticed something below the roadway, down an embankment in rural Douglas County. It was Rhonda. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body appeared to have been left beside the isolated road, far from the location where she had last been seen. Police now had to reconstruct the missing hours between her walk through Denver and the discovery outside Sedalia. They learned that during the weeks before her death, Rhonda had been staying with different acquaintances. One of those acquaintances quickly became a person of interest. Detectives examined that person's movements and possible connection to the crime. But the investigation eventually cleared them. Police then began looking beyond Rhonda's immediate circle. During the 1970s and 1980s, a number of violent offenders were operating around metropolitan Denver. Some targeted women who were alone. Some used drugs, threats, or physical violence to control their victims. Others were already suspected of committing multiple attacks. Detectives examined several of them, but nothing conclusively connected any known offender to Rhonda. There were no surveillance cameras covering every street. There were no mobile phones recording a person's location, and forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Investigators could collect biological evidence, preserve it, and hope that science would eventually become powerful enough to explain what they had found. At Rhonda's crime scene, someone made a decision that would later become critical. Paper bags were placed over her hands to preserve possible trace evidence. It was a normal investigative step. The bags themselves were not considered clues. They were simply there to stop evidence from being lost. The case continued. Detectives interviewed people, reviewed possible suspects, and examined connections to known serial offenders. But the leads slowly disappeared. Years passed, then decades. The person who killed Rhonda appeared to have escaped. But while detectives were studying the people in Rhonda's life, another man was already moving through the Denver area. His name was Vincent Darrell Groves. Groves had been convicted of murder in 1982. Despite receiving a lengthy sentence, he served fewer than 5 years before being released in 1987. The same year Rhonda Fisher was killed. Groves's violence was not confined to one sudden incident. Investigators later connected him to a pattern of attacks against vulnerable women between 1978 and 1988. His criminal activity also involved drugs and sex trafficking. He entered worlds where women could disappear without receiving immediate public attention, and where witnesses were sometimes frightened of speaking to police. Less than 2 months after Groves returned to the streets, Rhonda was last seen walking through Denver. But in 1987, detectives could not prove that their paths had ever crossed. They did not know whether Rhonda entered his vehicle, met him through someone else, or encountered him by chance. Even today, investigators have not publicly explained exactly how Groves came into contact with her. The only thing now considered certain is that something belonging to him reached her hands. After Rhonda's murder, Groves continued committing violent crimes. He was eventually convicted in connection with 2 murders from 1988 and returned to prison. He died in custody in 1996, but death did not end the investigation into his crimes. As DNA technology advanced, old evidence from unsolved Denver murders was tested again. Biological material began connecting Groves to women whose killers had remained unidentified for years. Cases that once appeared unrelated began forming a pattern. By 2012, authorities said he could have been responsible for as many as 20 killings. But Rhonda's case remained unresolved. Her evidence had been tested again in 2017. The results were disappointing. Scientists could not produce a complete DNA profile capable of identifying her attacker. Another opportunity appeared to have failed, and there was an additional problem. Every time old evidence is tested, some of it may be consumed. Cold case detectives must decide whether to use the remaining material with today's technology or preserve it in the hope that tomorrow's technology will be better. In Rhonda's case, investigators continued waiting. Then, in early 2025, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office reopened the file. A cold case team began reviewing everything again. Not only the original reports, not only the obvious biological evidence. They examined the containers, packaging, and materials that had been stored with Rhonda's body. That included the 2 brown paper bags. For 38 years, those bags had been treated as objects used to preserve evidence. Now investigators asked a different question. What if the bags had become evidence? When the bags were placed over Rhonda's hands in 1987, tiny biological traces from her skin transferred onto the paper. But Rhonda's DNA was not the only material that transferred. Someone else's skin cells were there too. The amount was microscopic. The cells could not be seen. Nobody examining the bags in 1987 would have known they were preserving the identity of a murderer, but modern testing recovered a viable DNA profile. In late October of 2025, the combined DNA index system produced a case-to-case match. The profile recovered from Rhonda's paper bags matched biological evidence from 3 Denver homicides committed in 1979. Those crimes had already been connected to Vincent Groves. The killer investigators had spent 38 years trying to identify had been in their wider orbit all along. He had already murdered before Rhonda died. He had already been convicted. He had already been imprisoned. And then the justice system released him. Rhonda was killed shortly afterward. The person investigators initially considered in her case had been innocent. The known offenders they examined had included many dangerous men, but the proof had been sitting on the inside surface of 2 paper bags. Not enough proof for the technology of 1987. Not enough for the renewed testing in 2017, but enough for 2025. Douglas County authorities officially identified Vincent Darrell Groves as Rhonda Fisher's killer. They believe Groves was responsible for at least 12 homicides, as well as an attempted murder and a sexual assault. Investigators have also said that the true number of his victims may be higher, but Groves could never be arrested for Rhonda's murder. He could never be questioned about where he met her. He could never explain why he took her from Denver to rural Douglas County. And he could never stand in court while Rhonda's surviving family heard the evidence against him. He had died 29 years before the DNA match was discovered. For Rhonda's family, the announcement provided an answer, but not complete justice. Her parents and her brother had already died without learning who killed her. Authorities were able to contact one of her cousins and finally explain what investigators now believed had happened. There are still missing pieces. Nobody has publicly established how Rhonda and Groves met. There is no recorded confession. And because Groves cannot be questioned, the final hours of Rhonda's life may never be fully reconstructed. But her case also contains an extraordinary reversal. In 1987, detectives covered Rhonda's hands because they feared the evidence might disappear. The killer probably believed he had left nothing behind that could identify him. For decades, that appeared to be true. but every time he touched Rhonda, he left microscopic pieces of himself behind. Those cells transferred from her skin to the paper placed over her hands. The bags were folded, sealed, stored, and forgotten. Vincent Groves died, believing that whatever happened on South Perry Park Road had disappeared with Rhonda. But the evidence had never disappeared. It was only waiting for science to learn how to read it. And 38 years after a passing driver looked down a Colorado embankment and discovered Rhonda Fisher, 2 ordinary paper bags finally spoke the name of her killer.